We Hold These Truths, a reverent review of the U.S. Constitution by Patton McDonald. Chapter 9. The Power of the Presidency. Herbert Hoover was inaugurated president in March 1929. The stock market crashed in October. The nation sank into depression. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 supposedly had provided regulations to guarantee a sound banking system, but in the 1930s, bank failures were commonplace. There was nothing grievously wrong with the American free market system except that which had been caused by government. If restored to freedom, a free market economy would have made satisfactory adjustments, not quickly, but surely. The people then were in no mood to wait for a slow cure that seemed uncertain, because a quick, sure remedy was offered at once by the federal government. Never suggesting that government intervention had wrecked the free market, but implying that it was in disarray because of innate instability, government attacked the Depression with an increased application of the same interventionism that had caused it in the first place. Much of what the Hoover administration did was unconstitutional, but the Supreme Court did not stand in the way. In years past, the court had already prepared the way for the federal government to do almost anything government officialdom claimed to be needed. The Hoover administration created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the Home Loan Bank, and other agencies, and it expanded the activities of existing agencies such as the Farm Loan Bank. The federal government instituted huge public works programs to stimulate business and create jobs. It enacted legislation to relieve states and municipalities groaning under the burden of the economic crisis which government had caused. Conditions grew worse. While federal government-caused inflation was driving living costs up, government-caused overproduction of wheat was driving wheat prices down, never suggesting that government had caused the wheat farmers' problems, but implying that they had resulted from a free market's inherent inability to regulate agricultural production properly. Government intervened to help wheat farmers under the Farm Stabilization Act of 1929 by purchasing and storing 257 million bushels of wheat. That helped a little at first, but in 1931 and 1932 the government flooded the market with its stored wheat. That drove wheat prices down to the lowest level on record. Many farmers, whom government had helped a little in 1929, were driven into bankruptcy by government help in 1932, and Herbert Hoover was voted out of office. The people had learned it was absurd to continue on a road that was heading them toward ruin. They had been instinctively right in wanting a return to traditional American foreign policy at the close of World War I. By the end of the 1920s, they wanted a return to traditional domestic policies too. They wanted constitutional government. The voters were demanding a federal government that would look after foreign affairs and defense, but would leave the people alone to manage their own affairs under state laws and programs. Franklin D. Roosevelt, then governor of New York, promised to deliver what they wanted. On July 26, 1929, Roosevelt, addressing a conference of governors, said, "Our nation has been a successful experiment in democratic government because the individual states have waived in only a few instances their sovereign rights. But there is a tendency, and to my mind a dangerous tendency, on the part of our national government to encroach on one excuse or another more and more upon state supremacy. The elastic theory of interstate commerce, for instance, has been stretched almost to the breaking point to cover certain regulatory powers desired by Washington." In a radio speech on March 2, 1930, Roosevelt said, "Under the 18th Amendment, Congress has been given the right to legislate on this particular subject, liquor, but this is not the case in the matter of a great number of other vital problems of government, such as in the conduct of public utilities, of banks, of insurance, of business, of agriculture, of education, social welfare, and of a dozen other features. In these, Washington must not be encouraged to interfere. In 1932, Roosevelt successfully campaigned for the presidency on a states' rights platform which promised to reduce federal expenditures, cut down federal power, and return it to the individual states where, according to the Constitution, it belongs. Whatever else he may have lacked, Franklin D. Roosevelt had leadership capabilities. His leadership had helped to articulate a deep national conviction that all the nation needed to get out of the Depression was renewed public confidence in the free market system which governmental intervention had shattered. But once in office, Roosevelt marched in the opposite direction, and he succeeded in luring the public to follow him as he attacked the Depression by egregiously expanding the governmental intervention which had caused it. The power necessary for dictatorship had gravitated to Washington long before Roosevelt assumed the presidency, but FDR was the pioneer who showed how to pull it all together, and he used this illicit power to breed more until it became great enough to perpetuate itself. Before Roosevelt, there were incumbent presidents, including Herbert Hoover, who were defeated when running for re-election, but not since, except for George Bush. FDR built the federal government into a power colossus whose strength can be focused on the job of re-electing a president. The whole system of American government was so altered that before many years had passed, any politician wanting or holding public office, from city councilman to president, could promote his own political ambitions with promises and threats about how he would help use federal power. That practice funnels more power into Washington. Statesmanship at all levels of government has come to mean cunning, skill, and daring in getting federal money for programs which further nourish the system by feeding more illicit power into Washington. Roosevelt originated the practice of using the power and prestige of the presidency for presidential salesmanship to get what he wanted. The practice has escalated under all succeeding presidents until now. The entire world routinely beholds via television the great spectacular, Secret Service agents scurrying about, helicopters flying overhead, lines of saluting servicemen in dress uniforms standing at rigid attention, crowds and local dignitaries gathered in welcome, and bands playing Hail to the Chief as the President deplanes from Air Force One. The President's influence and power over public opinion and thus the public are now incalculable. The basic tactic Roosevelt seized upon to build the kind of federal establishment he wanted was the use of public money to buy political support. The practice has grown under succeeding presidents, and the public attitude toward it has altered. During the Roosevelt administration, members of Congress were many times promised new or enlarged federal spending that was extremely important to them, but only if they supported something the president wanted. Or it could work in reverse, as a threat that spending would be stopped, and sometimes federal spending was cut to punish a member of Congress for not supporting Roosevelt. The same tactic was used on mayors, governors, and businessmen throughout the nation. During the Kennedy administration, presidential use of the tactics and language of organized gangsterism had become a known and accepted, sometimes praised, presidential practice. Under Lyndon Johnson, the practice was playfully reported in the press as arm twisting. Richard Nixon used the practice to the full extent of his capabilities, but he was not as skillful at it as Johnson had been. Was President Ford any different? Note this from the April 5, 1976 issue of U.S. News and World Report. Since the governor of South Carolina, James B. Edwards, rebuffed Mr. Ford by endorsing Reagan for president, federal grants for his state have practically dried up. An embittered South Carolina official quoted a White House source as saying, "Tough, but that's the way the game is played." Another presidential practice that Roosevelt pioneered was the meeting with other heads of state for summit conferences. This bypassing of normal diplomatic procedures enables American presidents to make secret deals and to arrange for executive agreements which have the force of treaties. Yet they are beyond the reach of the Senate's constitutional authority to examine and ratify or reject treaties with foreign powers. All presidents since Roosevelt have used the summit talk tactic to burnish their own images at home and to make new accords with foreign countries, often communist dictatorships. Though technically not unconstitutional, the summit meetings have helped initiate programs that are. Such summitry from Roosevelt to Bill Clinton has done incalculable harm to every vital national interest of the United States.